Hello and welcome to EDUC 749, Week 6. Hope you've had a good week and weekend. I know here for us in my school district, we just finished school for the school year, so that made for a busy last week, but also a fun last week. So I'm sure you guys are either probably close to finishing, have finished, and all that goes along with that, and getting your summer started. So we will jump into Week 6. I'm going to take a step back to Week 4, simply because in Week 4 you reviewed case studies, and two of those case studies in particular dealt with behavior and how we could approach students' behavior. And one of the reasons why I wanted to go back to behavior was the feedback that you've given me this week about things that you'd like to work on. I'm going to jump ahead to that. Oops. So the things that you said you wanted to get more information on in the last couple of weeks of the class, your number one priority was IEPs and IEP goals. We'll spend some time on that most likely in Week 8. Your number two priority, and I lumped a few things together, inclusive practices in UDL. We've done some work on UDL, but we will definitely in Week 7 address some other inclusive practices, primarily in the forms of co-teaching. And then the third priority, and again I lumped a couple of things together, was autism and behavior management. And so what I wanted to do was go back to what you submitted in Week 4, where several of you addressed the case studies that dealt with behavior management. And I wanted to highlight a few of the things that you said, because there was some really great thoughts in your assignments from Module 4. So Christine talked about the importance of a structured social-emotional program. And one of the things she said is right here: talking about respect once or twice with specific examples is not the same as partaking in a more structured social-emotional program. And she also referenced social-wide instruction and modeling, things like positive behavior instruction and supports, PBIS. Those are really good proactive kinds of approaches to dealing with behavior. Lindsay said something very similar, talking about Anthony, and she made a couple of really great suggestions about having him track his behavior himself so that he could self-monitor. That is a great strategy, a great approach that's research-based for kids to track their own behaviors, keep themselves on track with their behavior. And again, she reinforced this might be better than simply reminding him every time not to push. How many times do we do that as teachers, where we respond after the fact and we give a verbal reminder? We know most of the time verbal reminders aren't effective, so what can we do to teach proactively what a student should be doing to address their behavior? Lindsay also made a point about looking at the overall history of his school and home life, and so that's where we're going to talk some about functional behavior assessments, because that's part of what an FBA will do, is look at the student's whole picture, school, home, everything that's going in, to determine what we should do to approach that behavior. Similarly, Stephanie made the point that a behavior plan, and she cited a resource there, Campbell and Anderson. A behavior plan can be a highly productive way to encourage positive interactions in the classroom, and that's a great point. So thinking about in these case studies, certainly an FBA behavior intervention plan may not be necessary. They're not necessary every time a behavior happens. But if those behaviors persist and are really impeding a student's educational performance, it might be something that we would need to consider is moving forward with that FBA and behavior plan process. So one of the things that I have included in Canvas for this week is an example of a functional behavior assessment and behavior intervention plan. So I thought I would just walk you through those really quickly, and you can look at them in more detail. These are from South Bend schools in Indiana, but most functional behavior assessments are fairly similar. It's just a formatting issue. The content really, most of the time, doesn't vary too much. Functional behavior assessment is just that. It is an assessment of behavior. So you can see here several sources of information: parent interview, teacher interview, Student interview could be a part of that. Reinforcement survey. What is reinforcing to students? What do they like to do? Looking at different inventories that might be done, other behavioral observations, student interviews, those types of things, so that we can get a full picture of that behavior. Looking at the strengths is really important in an FBA. What is the student good at? What motivates him? What are his preferences? What are the things that you think get him excited about school? Those are things that we want to make sure to capture in a behavior plan. Looking at the behaviors of concern, identifying them, making them specific and measurable. Then it really gets into looking at some of these related deficits, things like precipitating factors. For example, the student, I think it was Anthony, who had visual impairments. That would be where this would go as a precipitating factor, because we were thinking that some of the reasons of his behavior may be because of his vision, and he's pushing students to get their attention so that he can see them. Setting events, are there certain class periods where a behavior is more likely to occur? Is it most likely in math? Is it most likely on Mondays when students are coming back to school after a long weekend? Those are the kind of setting events that are important to consider. Antecedents are also an important factor. Some of you may be familiar with ABC charts, antecedent behavior consequence. Really what an antecedent is what happened right before the behavior. That's really important as we try to address what are we going to do for that student to know what happened right before the behavior. Maintaining consequences. What is it that we think is causing the behavior to continue and be maintained? Is it that a student is getting attention? Is it that he's getting out of a task because he's being sent to the office? What do we think is maintaining that behavior? And a really important piece is, what are the related deficits? What do we need to teach the student to help him with his behavior? So it could be that he, like Anthony, maybe he doesn't understand how to ask a student to move out of his space so that he can see him better. We need to teach him that skill. We need to teach him that social skill. There are lots of other examples of deficits that could happen that could cause a student to engage in inappropriate behavior. And then finally, at the end of this functional behavior assessment, and again, pretty much any of them, you're pulling together your data, summarizing your data in terms of frequency, duration, and intensity. And finally, most FBAs do have a hypothesis statement. When the expectation is what? The setting event. The student is likely to engage in what behavior because of a deficit in what specific skill. So that functional behavior assessment is really important to set the stage and lay the groundwork for the second document that I put in your in Canvas, which is a behavior intervention plan. So this is going to build on all that data that you collected. What's the behavior of concern? What's the hypothesis of the function of the behavior? Is it to gain attention? Is it to avoid a task? Why do we think the student is doing that behavior? What are the proactive strategies? These are what those examples that I shared from the week 4 assignment you were talking about. What are how we need to teach students appropriate behaviors? What are those instructional strategies that we need to do to help that student with behavior? What do we need to change in their antecedents? So if we know this is what was happening right before the behavior happened, what do we need to change in our environment to support that? Positive consequence strategies. How do we reinforce appropriate behavior? And are there things that we need to remove? Are there things and negatively that we not necessarily punishment, but sometimes we have to remove reinforcers to change behavior, and so that can be a part of the consequence approach as well. What is the behavioral goal or skills that we need to teach, and what available resources are there for the family or the school personnel in addressing that behavior? So these are just a real quick summary of the FBA and behavior intervention plan process, but I wanted to address that with you because that had come up in week 4, and again, several of you had indicated that in your emails to me this week. So, week 6, you're going to talk about disproportionality. You're going to spend some time learning more about disproportionality. It really is the looking at disproportionate representation of different races and ethnicities in special education. So, things like certain racial or ethnic groups being at a greater risk of being identified for special education. and also being at greater risk of being identified for specific disabilities. So the example that I can share with you about that is my district, Avon in Indiana. We, up until this past year, were identified as disproportionate, specifically in the area of white students with autism. So the federal government, our State Department of Education, looks at this data and they said, Avon, you're disproportionate. You have too many white students identified with autism. So we had to look at that with our school psychologists and our special education department to address that and put in place some different practices and procedures. Similarly, also a part of disproportionality is looking at students' educational environment placement. So do we have too many students with autism in more self-contained settings, or too many students with learning disabilities in self-contained settings, too many African American students in self-contained settings? All that data is analyzed, as well as discipline. How do we do with suspensions and expulsions? That was another area where we were found to be disproportionate. We were suspending and expelling students with disabilities at a higher rate than we should have. We were also, there were some racial ethnic groups that were being suspended and expelled at a higher rate than they should have. And so that was all part of us being disproportionate. And the state, the federal government said we had to fix that. We had to use some of our special education funds to fix that. You'll also spend some time this week looking at low incidence disabilities. Those are students with certain disabilities that you may not have every year in your classroom. You probably are going to have students with learning disabilities or students with autism, but these are students with lower incidence that you may not have, but every few years a student with these disabilities in your classrooms. And so it's still important that we know what we need to do to address their needs. There's videos on disproportionality from Russ Skiba, who's kind of a leader in the country when it comes to disproportionality, as well as looking at minority representation in special education, and then how does that disproportionality conversation fit with RTI. There's also a great video that looks at technology strategies for students with low incidence disabilities. I like this video because there are so many embedded supports in this video that you can see how they have structured the entire video to meet a wide array of learner needs, just in those of us watching this video, that we can replicate for our students. A couple of assignments this week: discussion post on disproportionality, as well as an assignment looking at exceptionality in cultural situation scenarios. Adding to your discussion post, I would like you to send me an email or a message with one aha about disproportionality after you've gone through the module, and how could you use that aha in your classroom. And I really just, 2 sentences is all I'm asking. You don't need to cite anything. Quick and dirty is all I really need. The reason I'm doing this is because I think sometimes with disproportionality there may be things that you think you need to look at for your class that you don't want to put out there on a discussion post, but I'd like you to tell me that. So I gave an example here that I thought might be something I would think of when I was doing this as a classroom teacher. So my aha might have been that I was surprised that schools are held accountable for how different races and ethnicities are disciplined through suspension and expulsions. So as a teacher, I would want to look at my discipline referrals and make sure they're representative of the makeup of my class. So if my class is 25% African American, I should be able to look at my discipline referrals and they should be about 25%. If my discipline referrals are higher than that, then I know that maybe I need to look at my instruction and how I'm meeting the needs of my students. So that's kind of maybe a different level of introspection about your teaching style that I'd like you to share that with me, and 2 points of your discussion post this week will be just you sending me that email. So with that, we've already talked about the feedback that you gave me. I really appreciate you taking time to give me some feedback about the class. It has helped me as I think through the next couple of weeks. And with that, that's all I've got. I hope you have a great week, and let me know if you have any questions.